Dune Part 2 feels like nothing else. It's so otherworldly that it doubles back on itself and becomes utterly realistic. Watching it as an experience more akin to viewing a David Attenborough nature documentary than sifting through the CGI sludge that makes up many other blockbusters. Just like Planet Earth or Blue Planet 2, you sit immersed in the stillness and tension of a pristine natural environment before a cacophony of activity jolts you upright. Attenborough and Villeneuve both achieved the impossible. You end up rooting for someone or something you'll never be in a faraway place to survive just one more day in their harsh environment. For 2 hours and 47 minutes, you forget that there are writers and cinematographers and composers. You are there in the desert. Every object on screen feels as real and tangible as the branch a vulture clings to or the rock a lizard basks on. It is simply a masterpiece of immersion. And I believe the secret to this immersion lies in one word: I've identified 4 ways Denis Villeneuve and his collaborators used Restraint to craft Dune Part 2. Even with its heap of bombastic battles, only a mild budget increase was needed to depict the escalating events of Dune Part 2. This is despite the film running for nearly 3 hours and having to overcome all of the difficulties you encounter by shooting in real deserts, some nearly as hot in real life as those found on Arrakis itself. However, you shouldn't mistake the movie's lengthy running time for overindulgence by the filmmaker. His style requires an aggressive approach to cutting scenes, and even characters if necessary. Villeneuve is an efficient filmmaker. He has the self-control to gut elements which might provide more of the dreamy world-building he delivers on so well, but do not serve the central narrative. Dune Part 2 is exactly as long as it must be. In none of the discussions I've had about the film was the length ever brought up. In fact, the one major flaw I've heard mentioned by all the people I've now seen the film with is that Paul's decision to take the Water of Life felt too immediate. To put it another way, for some viewers, the pacing during the second act climax in this nearly 3-hour film was too fast. Many book fans point out that heavily compressing the time gap between the Harkonnen takeover and their eventual overthrow was the cause of this issue, and I can't really disagree. I would have been happy to see an extra 15 minutes added, if that was necessary to set this moment up more effectively. A criticism levelled at Dune Part 1 was its constant use of soundtrack. While having too much Hans Zimmer in your movie is just about the best problem you could hope for, it was definitely noticeable in the first film. In Part 2, there are quiet moments to make space for discussion, reflection and levity, with the wonderfully tense final showdown forgoing a soundtrack entirely. Here, the score does a better job of blending into the shifting sands, only swelling to meet the moment when most called for. Restraint isn't just demonstrated by how the score is spread out across the scenes, but in the compositions themselves. The romance theme for Paul and Chani features only 2 instruments over a bed of ambient desert sounds, an electric cello and a duduk, modified with plastic pipes from Home Depot, of all places, appropriate for a track about the bond between 2 people. Another of Villeneuve's quirks seems to be casting very famous actors for minuscule portions of the runtime. Anya Taylor-Joy is the obvious example, with what must have been less than 30 seconds, though we do hear her voice a few more times throughout. The same was true of Zendaya in Part 1, before her much expanded role in the sequel. Waving these briefly used stars around in your cast list is definitely smart marketing, but it also makes complete sense, given Paul's premonitions of the people who will meet in the future. Another example here is Léa Seydoux, playing Lady Margot Fenring. She had about 5 minutes at most, but they were an extremely efficient 5 minutes. Villeneuve used them masterfully to inform the audience about 7 crucial details. 1. The depth of Feyd-Rautha's evil, an evil tempered only by loyalty and shame. 2. The moral vacuum at the core of the Bene Gesserit cult. 3. The fact that the Reverend Mother is willing to endanger anyone, even her own followers, to maintain control. 4. The Bene Gesserit obsession with Harkonnens, which sets up the shock reveal of Lady Jessica's Harkonnen lineage. 5. The extent to which Lady Jessica has become a pariah from her own sect, by showing the audience how a proper Bene Gesserit operates. 6. The evolution of their manipulation tactics, from seduction to complete control. 7. Finally, and most spectacularly, her 5 minutes of screen time shows the insanely oppressive Harkonnen homeworld of Giedi Prime through a foreigner's eyes. Then there is Stellan Skarsgård. During production of Part 1, he petitioned Villeneuve to reduce the Baron's time on screen, and not just to avoid more days spent in the excruciating makeup chair. His idea was to increase the intimidation factor of the Harkonnen leader by making sure he only appeared during matters of great importance. The Baron would obviously get his lackeys to carry out all tasks he deemed to be beneath him, both metaphorically and literally. The idea of less is more was also applied to the Bene Gesserit characters. Although Rebecca Ferguson definitely had the right instinct when she appealed for Lady Jessica to forego a full face covering, placing a veil over the Reverend Mother was absolutely the right call. She makes for a truly terrifying presence due to the lack of information we can glean from her features, while she seems to know everything about everyone she meets. By resisting the temptation to overuse these excellent, magnetic characters like the Baron or the Reverend Mother, Villeneuve allowed them to retain their power. It subconsciously tells us that they aren't to be troubled by minor matters. The commandments they issue are followed, full stop. No need to have weekly progress reports when you are so psychologically terrifying that not a single living soul has ever disobeyed you. Dune is not a cinematic universe. It is a real universe we are given the privilege of travelling to, our vector of travel being the cinema screen. It's wonderful to finally enjoy popular science fiction which takes itself seriously and treats its characters as if they really exist. In the short few years between the release of the first and second Dune films, the so-called cinematic universe as a storytelling method has collapsed into an unprofitable joke. Why? Because the many stories of which they usually comprise do not contain human beings. Instead, their characters are lifeless husks or over-talented, irritating prodigies or utterly moronic vessels for plot progression. They are never interesting because they are never consistent, oscillating from one sludge-brained decision to the next, with no regard for how their past might inform their present. For all of its amazing spectacle, Dune Part 2 never wastes its time on a visual which does not enhance some human moment of innovation, pain, realization, relief, vice, or betrayal. Sure, there are necessary shots to display plot information, like the explosion of the spice depot, the entry of the Emperor's ship onto Arrakis, or the sandworms charging south into the storm. All gloriously brought to life by supremely talented artists. But the shots that really stayed with me? How about Paul Atreides standing alone in a sea of 1 million fundamentalists, illuminated from above as he reads their minds one by one? Baron Harkonnen lying breathless on the steps just below the chair he so covets. Lady Jessica's blue eyes darting around the room with glee as she tightens her grip on the devout Fremen followers. This treatment isn't just reserved for the central characters either. We see a defeated defender of Sietch Tabor, the blood of the invader splattered across her face, her defiance wavering as she stares down the barrel of a Harkonnen flamethrower. We see one of the Baron's ornithopter pilots panic as Raban snaps his colleague's neck in frustration. And in possibly my favourite moment of the film, we see a Sardaukar soldier pick himself up after surviving an atomic shockwave and raise the Emperor's flag proudly above him. That we got so many of these human moments to cherish is thanks to the director's restraint, his willingness to cut short any unmotivated spectacle and carve out the time to discover more about the cultures of the Fremen, the Bene Gesserit and the Harkonnens. This is demonstrated early on in the film during the montage of Fremen attacks against Harkonnen spice harvesters. This sequence alone likely contains more Oscar-worthy VFX shots than the average blockbuster, yet they are all reduced to short 3-second vignettes. The story demands that we see no more and no less, and Villeneuve chose to serve the story first and foremost. Every shot has a purpose. The scene which introduces us to Fremen battle tactics starts with the scuttling of a tiny mouse and ends with the bone-shaking explosion of a mining crawler. The first shot establishes how the Fremen are able to lay ambushes so effectively while setting up the premise behind Paul's chosen fighting game. I could go on and on, but here I will take a leaf out of Denis Villeneuve's book and deploy some restraint. Dune Part 2 is the Star Wars of our generation, a film with excellent word of mouth, an experience that must be seen on the big screen, with some of the most impactful sound design, music and visual effects so far this century. Every aspect of Dune Part 2 benefits from masterful restraint. It's a big budget space adventure without the bloat, without the quippy humour, without it being necessary to read 5 comic books and watch 10 TV shows to understand the narrative. It remains to be seen if Denis Villeneuve can best the skeptics and make the completely unfilmable Dune Messiah into a worthy adaptation. His work on Blade Runner 2049 indicates an excellent level of tact when it comes to mining a sequel from what seemed to everyone else like a depleted vein of potential. The ending of Dune Part 2 leaves us in no doubt that Paul's story is not yet finished. Villeneuve had the restraint to leave his ego aside despite making a movie based on his favourite childhood book. On the other hand, he also resisted what must have been a multitude of studio voices calling for a hollowed out but expedient and potentially more profitable sequel. In doing so, he has crafted a story which builds and builds, every passing minute adding richness to its beautifully realised universe.